professor, physician, epidemiologist. I am Dr. Sri Banerjee.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sri Banerjee, core faculty for the College of Health Sciences and Public Policy at Walden University with a joint faculty appointment with the Ross University School of Medicine. And it is with great joy that I wanted to talk about the recent social determinants of health distance learning grant that I and myself and Dr. Brian Ragsdale and Dr. Dr. McFeeters and others who are part of the grant. And recently I was forwarded this from Dr. Ragsdale talking about the roots of structural racism and how this is actually something that was released in 2021. And if you're thinking about, and they actually have an interactive map showing some of the characteristics of the segregation that's taking place. And here's a quick map I'm going to switch over to, and here you can see the map. And the red is high segregation. In the south, you can see, and all over in the city, all the way up to the northeast, you can see that. But as you go westward, you can see high amounts of, for instance, in Alabama, Mississippi, you see the whole state with high levels of segregation. And what is ironic is that as immigration increases, the segregation just keeps increasing because these are not addressed at a community level, and there's not active work done in this area. And so the hope is that through working on this grant and work that other people, the good work that other people are doing, we can try to address the social determinants in a more streamlined fashion. So going back to the main report and just looking at a good overview of this, you can kind of see here's the key report findings, and it might be good to examine these more so than anything. There's only about 12 of them, so I'll go through them. So number one is this: out of every metropolitan region in the United States with more than 200,000 residents, 81% were more segregated as of 2019 than were in 1990. So what this is saying is that segregation increased 81% from 1990. In 20 years, segregation increased 81%, even though it's supposed to decrease. The Rust Belt cities, these were the affected cities from when there was a lot of jobs lost due to jobs going overseas, and industrial Midwest and Mid-Atlantic disproportionately make up the top 10 most segregated cities list. This also includes Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Trenton. So these cities that I have listed are in the top 10 most segregated cities in the U.S. So out of number 3, out of the 113 largest cities examined, only Colorado Springs, Colorado, and Port St. Lucie, Florida, qualify as integrated. And this was a rubric that Berkeley came up with that shows all of these. Number 4, neighborhood poverty rates are highest in segregated communities of color. So that would be 21% there, which is 3 times higher than in segregated white neighborhoods, which is only 7%. So segregated communities of color are have higher poverty rates than on the white neighborhoods. which is 7%. Black children raised in integrated neighborhoods earn nearly $1,000 more as adults per year, and $4,000 more when raised in white neighborhoods than those raised in highly segregated communities of color. So that's $3,000 difference in earnings for black children who are raised in white neighborhoods versus in versus an integrated neighborhood and white neighborhood. So it's just interesting to kind of look at all aspects of that. Number 6 is Latino children raised in integrated neighborhoods earn $844 more per year as adults, and $5,000 more when raised in white neighborhoods than those raised in highly segregated communities of color. So let me back up a little bit. So what's happening here? They're categorizing neighborhoods into 3 types. I think we have to back up and think about how this is being presented. So 1, you have communities of color. 2, you have white neighborhoods, and then 3, you have integrated neighborhoods. And as I said, there's only 2 communities with integrated neighborhoods. So now they're talking about children being raised in integrated communities versus when they become adults, and how that influences earnings. So this is how 5 and 6 are working. And most of the times, what the findings show is that children that were raised in white neighborhoods, as adults, they're actually earning a lot more. So moving on to number 7, household incomes and home values in white neighborhoods are nearly twice as high as those in segregated communities of color. What does that say? It has some of the redlining that, of course, was occurring where real estate in certain parts were devalued. Well, a lot of these disparities that actually developed in the 30s are still perpetuated today through existing disparities. Number 8, talking about home ownership, is 77% in highly segregated white neighborhoods, and 59% in well-integrated neighborhoods, but in communities of color, again, much lower, 46%. So only 46% in communities of color actually own homes. Number 9, 83% of neighborhoods that were given poor ratings, or redlining, and I was just talking about that, in the 1930s by a federal mortgage policy, were, as of 2010, highly segregated communities of color. Like I was saying, the disparities that were perpetuated from the 30s, actually, even 80 years from then, were seen. We have 3 more left of the key findings. Number 10 is regions with higher levels of residential segregation have higher levels of political polarization, an important implication in the context of gerrymandering and voter suppression. What does this all mean? Political polarization is causing all this. Well, it's simple. If you have a polarized society, if you have if you have Democrats versus Republicans, and extreme forms of the right versus left, and these extreme views clash, and for instance, in Charlottesville, and some of the other incidents where one side was clearly wrong in the extremism, but Bottom line is when you have extreme polar opposites in political leanings, then one side will try to influence the geographic area to influence and increase the number of votes that are coming from that area. So the deliberate changing of lines in order to increase the advantage of a party, this is what gerrymandering is, and very unethical and illegal. And this leads to voter suppression. So number 11 and 12, the most segregated regions are the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic, followed by the West Coast. And then number 12, southern states have lower overall levels of segregation, and the Mountain West and Plains states have the least. And according to the map, I did see levels of segregation still there in the South as well. So maybe these rates are not as high, but I think there's still some of the segregation. So then it goes into a lot of detail and really starts with the culminating in the brutal murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police. It was a tragic incident, and that prompted media organizations to label a national reckoning on race. So a greater portion of the American public awakened to the fact that too many people of color were disadvantaged in ways that seemed to shape life chances and overall well-being. So racial disparities in health and well-being, policing and the criminal justice system, schools and universities, corporations and labor markets, neighborhoods and housing are stark and difficult to ignore. They have to, the disparities have to be addressed. Whereas such disparities may once have been attributed to differences in intelligence, and I talk about the Stanford Binet and how it has its roots actually in eugenics, believe it or not. But also motivation or effort, the surge in anti-racism activism and reading has helped engender greater awareness of the structural inequities that underpin these outcomes. How do they manifest? Circumstances and conditions contribute to these outcomes. Subtle differences in treatment or care create stunning inequities. And that's important to know. But there's a lack of appreciation of racial residential segregation. And this, by the way, this is something that can be that is easily mapped, and I have several maps that I've created on residential segregation. And there's several types of, for instance, white versus non-white through county health rankings. You can do a separate map on that, and then you can do one which is white versus non-Hispanic black. So there's different ways you can categorize, and residential segregation connects or fails to connect residents to good schools, nutritious foods, healthy environments, good paying jobs, access to healthcare, clinics, critical amenities and services. So aggressive broken windows policing practices target racially and economically isolated black and brown neighborhoods, while jobs and the tax dollars flow to white communities, leaving crumbling infrastructure, poisonous water, predatory financial institutions, and food deserts behind. So over-policing is a problem here, and for these reasons and many more, racial residential segregation continues to be an issue and remains the linchpin, the deep root cause that sustains systemic racial inequality. So what it is that a lot of the, not only policing practices, policies, a lot of the disparities that exist between communities, and crumbling infrastructure. For instance, I know even in areas of Atlanta, there's places around the airport which in certain times were not as developed. Even the highway in that area had a lot of crumbling sort of infrastructure. And I know there's been more recent bills that have been at least passed trillions of dollars, but the hope is that this will be an integrated system, and future urban planning will include different approaches with residential segregation in mind. For many middle-aged African Americans, the short-lived experiment in educational desegregation has been a mixed bag. Desegregation proved fleeting. Hostility and unrelenting opposition to integration produced bursts of violence, even in Chicago and Boston. And of course, that accelerated white flight, which is a lot of Caucasians started to move out into the suburbs, which further undermined the project of federally mandated desegregation, and largely abandoned this effort in the 90s. The nation never embarked upon a national project to integrate neighborhoods, even though school desegregation took place. But there was no effort to integrate neighborhoods. So it's almost, it makes no sense, because you're having certain individuals being bused into different neighborhoods, and having to go through different neighborhoods, and then go to schools where majority are a different race or ethnic background, and so this creates a sort of conundrum, and which is important to address. Why was there no project to integrate neighborhoods? There's never been a Brown versus Board education-like decision for housing. We know for decades housing has been a result of segregation, but nothing was done. And in a wide scale, integrating neighborhoods was always going to be more difficult than integrating schools, and that is a fact. But no matter how unpopular, schools could be assigned to different schools in a district or a region by a central public authority under the mandate of federal courts, and bused accordingly. But there is no comparable institution or authority that has the power to compel the integration of neighborhoods and communities, and that's where we run into the problem. Although progress incrementally slowed each subsequent decade, the in-migration of people of color into the suburbs, especially between 1990 and 2000, seemed to suggest a different and more hopeful racial trajectory, such that two economists declared the end of the segregated century. There was a downward trend, but as you see, these encouraging observations turned out not to reflect the actual dynamics of what was going on the ground. Schools have gradually resegregated in the 65 years since. For one, Brown versus Board of Education was decided, of course, 65 years ago, but since then, they've resegregated. The problem today is that our nation's public schools replicate the demographic profiles of the communities and neighborhoods they serve. And so we get back to the same problem, is that you've had school desegregation without neighborhood desegregation. So what happens is the neighborhood desegregation, or the neighborhood segregation, should I say, is then now perpetuated back to the school. So the desegregation from Brown versus Board of Education, even though there has been progress made, but without integrating household, and as I said earlier, some of this did take place, but it just needed to be done more completely. So given the failures of integration, many anti-racism advocates evince ambivalence about integration itself. And this might be increasing abuse of policing, inadequate healthcare. But if we focus on, instead of trying to integrate societies, if we try to focus on addressing abusive policing, importantly, inadequate healthcare, addressing that, underperforming schools, how many students are to each teacher? In some classes, there's within elementary schools, there are 30 students per teacher, and so there's not enough personal attention there. And so there's ways that this can be addressed, and for example, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi writes, what really made the schools unequal were the dramatically unequal resources provided to them that couldn't be further from the truth. Not the mere fact of racial separation. So it's not the fact that there was physical segregation, of course this contributed to that, but it wasn't that, it was how the resources were allocated to the various schools. And you see evidence of that when you study this on the local level. Here's another, this is in bold, so it's important. It is unlikely that we can ever close out racial disparities, let alone significantly improve life outcomes for racially marginalized people in a racially segregated society. Racial residential segregation so effectively sorts people across space and bundles vitalizing resources that no redistribution plan can ever match the swift efficacy of the underlying mechanism. Quite a discouraging sort of statement, but I think we can strive to address disparities, and these are the reasons that public health has declared racism as an emergency, and I think more resources really need to focus on this, and provide whole courses on this as to how this applies to specific disciplines. So we explain segregation not only to perpetuate and sustain racial inequality, and how segregation does this, but as a widespread and surprisingly commonplace global driver of intergroup inequality. And so then they go into ways of understanding and describing being stuck within a 20th century paradigm to address these problems. More recently developed measures are recommended. So this allows for regional differences in segregation, identify the most and least segregated cities. Also, insights provided consistent and strong correlations between degree of racial residential segregation and key life outcomes such as poverty rates, home value and rent, educational achievement, life expectancy, economic mobility, and more. So it's not enough to just say, this is racially segregated. This is not how far racially segregated it is. is something that is also important to determine and measure. And I believe county health rankings actually allows for that further refinement of some of the categories. So looking at, of course, poverty rates and others, that has a direct association. So then, of course, looking at highly segregated white neighborhoods to highly segregated black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods and integrated neighborhoods, these were different ways to classify, and the earnings were different. This goes into the function and effects of segregation, some of the history. Residents of Japanese ancestry during World War II were interned, and you can see this in the historical picture. And anti-immigrant xenophobic sentiment always undergirds some of this in-group versus out-group hatred. And this is actually a school bus where there are some, actually one black child being bused in a bus full of white children. And this is from the suburbs to an inner city in Charlotte, North Carolina, in February 1973. And if you see kind of the gaze, in a way, of the other children, you can kind of see that the children, the African American children in the front, are not quite fitting with the whole group, and they're initially some of this was difficult to maneuver, but I think as time went along, some of this desegregation, at least in the schools, was more successful. Going into the economics literature on racial residential segregation, this also firmly establishes that economic outcomes, social mobility, are poor in more segregated areas. I think there's a lot of good parts to this paper, and looking at this chart, it's really nice to look. Actually, what is interesting, even more interesting here, is that a city very close to where I reside, Reading, PA, and fairly close to Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, PA, both of places, there have been the greatest increase, some of the greatest increase in segregation in 20 years, which is heartbreaking, honestly, because some of these closer areas I did not think, but there has been a change in 228% in Fayetteville, 1140%, and minus 24%. And then Reading, PA has an increase of 55% in increase in segregation, and then in percent Latino, and there's a vast Latino community in Reading, PA. I know from personal just visiting there. So the segregation has increased 312%, and in among white decreased 21%. Again, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, PA is also another place that is familiar to me, very much so. And there, percent black segregation has increased 232%. Percent Latino, 1,626%. That is the highest that I see in the whole country among percent Latino segregation. and percent white decreased 15%. So I'm not going to go through the whole list, but these were 3 places that I was very familiar with. Allentown I'm very familiar with as well. An increase in segregation among black population 174%, and then among Latino 304%. Greatest decrease in segregation, San Antonio, Texas, which is good news. I was there recently. Savannah, Georgia was there a while back. And there's been decrease in segregation, which is good news. Now, this is a little different. Top 10 most segregated metropolitan statistical areas. So it has to have minimum 200,000 people. And so it's most to least segregated. New York, New Jersey, Long Island is most segregated, and then for 10th for most least segregated. Well, I wouldn't say least segregated. These are the top 10 most segregated. So tied for 10 is Texas and New Orleans, Louisiana. These are the regions of segregation. I've taken up 30 minutes already, so this shows all the rates of segregation. So there's a lot of pages to this. I want to end with this. A great paradox of racial segregation in America is that segregation persists despite the nation's growing diversity. Are we doing a good job with diversity? Well, if we're measuring it in terms of racial residential segregation, no, we're not doing a good job. And also, despite the fact that there are fewer and fewer places that are racially homogenous, then we should have fewer and fewer places where there's racial desegregation, but that is not the case. And so there's a lot in conclusion, a lot of progress needing to be made, more empirical evidence, and I think geospatial technologies allow for more primary and secondary empirical evidence to support the fact from the social sciences that there's a persistent need to understand racial residential segregation, specifically as it pertains to racism and some of the broader topics of understanding inequities, health equity, and how that is a central focus in public health and many other disciplines. Here's a technical appendix with a lot of references and everything. I hope this has provided you with an overview of understanding how residential segregation is something that needs to be addressed and plays a vital role in poor outcomes. Thank you for listening.